Open our Bibles this morning to Peter's first epistle. As we continue our look and our walk through 1 Peter, which we began at the beginning of this year. And we'll be wrapping up in about 5 or 6 weeks or so. And we're all the way to the beginning of chapter 4. And we'll be looking at verses 1 through 6, and you can see on the screen behind me that I've titled the sermon this morning, The Christian's Armor Against Unjust Suffering. The Christian's Armor Against Unjust Suffering. And follow along with me as I read from verses 1 to 6. Since, therefore, Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same way of thinking. For whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, so as to live for the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for human passions, but for the will of God. For the time that is past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do, living in sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, and lawless idolatry. With respect to this, they are surprised when you do not join them in the same flood of debauchery, and they malign you. But they will give account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. For this is why the gospel was preached, even to those who are dead, that though judged in the flesh the way people are, they might live in the spirit the way God does. When sports writer Mitch Albom heard that his favorite college professor, whom he hadn't seen in 20 years, was dying of Lou Gehrig's disease, he began visiting him weekly. And in his best-selling book, Tuesdays with Maury, Mitch describes their visits, reminiscing on his old professor's wit and insights. One time, Mitch asked Maury why he bothered following the news, since he wouldn't be around to see how things turned out anyways because of his disease. And Maury responded saying this: "It's hard to explain, Mitch. Now that I'm suffering, I feel closer to people who suffer than I ever did before. The other night on TV, I saw people in Bosnia running across the street, getting fired on, speaking of the Kosovo War in 1999. I just started to cry. I feel their anguish as if it were my own. I don't know any of these people, but how can I put this? I'm almost drawn to them." And it's interesting how suffering can do that to you, isn't it? That when you are suffering, whatever form of suffering it may be, you develop a greater empathy for others that are also suffering, particularly those that are suffering in a similar way as you. And in a way that's hard to describe, that alone provides great comfort and encouragement to persevere through suffering, when we know others empathize with our suffering. And the greatest example and reality of this is Jesus. It's a profound comfort to know that Jesus understands and empathizes with our sufferings. It inspires us to persevere knowing Jesus empathizes with our sufferings, especially our suffering for doing good for the gospel's sake, because he too suffered and died in an infinitely more important way as our substitute to atone for sin and to reconcile sinners to God. And yet, even though his suffering was far more consequential and far-reaching, it is nevertheless the example for us to follow, because it is a mighty source of strength to carry us through. And that's precisely Peter's point in our text this morning. He wants us to remember Jesus' victory through suffering is yours. Remember Jesus' newness of life when God raised him from the dead is yours. And remember, Jesus is coming back to judge those who persecute you and will vindicate you. And remember the gospel about Jesus, which saves you, which keeps you, and which gives you imperishable, unfading, real, eternal hope. Remember Jesus. Remember Jesus. By way of review, for some of you who weren't with us, a couple weeks back, we looked in depth in suffering. Peter had already discussed suffering in a cursory way in chapter 1, verses 6 to 9. He used the example of Jesus' suffering in chapter 2, 21 to 25. But in chapter 3, verses 13 to 17, he took a deep dive into suffering, and particularly the reason for suffering, the kind of suffering that pleases God. It's suffering for doing good. There's great reward in that. In fact, Jesus was our example that he sets up there as the one who suffered for doing good, the ultimate and the greatest good in laying down his life to atone for sinners, to reconcile and to save us back to God. There's great reward in that. We looked at the hope in suffering, real eternal hope, as suffering now, presently, is the proof positive of genuine faith and that we will indeed be with him and have the hope of reward and heavenly inheritance. Right? We looked at our powerful witness in suffering, that when we do stay faithful and we don't revile when those revile us, and we don't respond tooth for tooth and nail for nail and eye for eye, it is a powerful testimony of our transformed lives, and God often can and does use that to draw sinners to himself. And we also looked at the expectation of suffering, that often it is God's will for us to suffer for doing good. That's what pleases him. That's what he says in verse 17. And then last week, as he continues to unpack the example of Christ in suffering, we looked at a very obscure text, perhaps the most obscure one in all the New Testament, as he tells us about Christ's sufferings, yes, but he does so in a strange way, where he talks about Christ having been put to death in the flesh and made alive in the spirit, and then after being made alive in the spirit, going to proclaim to the spirits who were in prison in Noah's day because their disobedience, their rejection of God. And yet God in his great mercy had patience and long suffering, and he spared a few, Noah, the righteous Noah and his family, through the waters of destruction of the flood, which then he goes on to talk about is an analogy of the baptismal waters that we as Christians pass through. But when we're submerged or immersed underwater, we're identifying with death, and Christ's death specifically as a judgment for sin. And when we emerge out of the waters, we identify with his new resurrection life. That's what baptism symbolizes, he says. It's not baptism that saves you, not the outward ceremony. It's what it represents in the inward reality of conversion and regeneration, of having a new heart. By faith, it's our faith that saves us. And then he ended that section in verse 22 on the most loftiest and grandiose notes of possible, describing for us the majestic Jesus in his resurrected glory and beauty and power, now seated at the right hand of power and of God, having all authority, all power, all majesty, all glory, universal reigning and ruling at the right hand of God, with all forces of darkness and of evil now subject to him at his feet. That's verse 22. And then in continuing to lift up Jesus as our example in suffering, in continuing to have us keep our gaze ever fixed on Jesus in suffering, and in telling us how we too can maintain victory in suffering and joy in suffering. What's the secret? It's remembering Jesus' victory through suffering is yours and is mine. And that's what he starts to say in verse 1. Since, therefore, Christ has suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same way of thinking, for whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. Since, therefore, those words draw us back to what he's just said. As a summary of what he's just said. He's saying, since, therefore, and what has he just said? Christ is reigning and ruling, having conquered triumphantly all the forces of darkness, including sin. And since he himself has died the death for sin, and of course, in a much more grandiose way, he suffered to atone for sin, you and I in a lesser way, but since Christ has done that, and he has conquered them, and you are conquering with him, he's saying, arm yourselves with the same way of thinking. Arm yourselves. He's saying, take on the attitude and the mentality and the mindset of Christ. Think about how Christ approached his suffering, he's saying, and use him as the model. Arm yourselves. And that word, arm, just like in the English, in the original Greek, has military connotations, right? It has to do with taking up armor, and especially armor on the offensive, going into battle. A common picture of the Christian life, isn't it? It's militant. We're fighting a battle. We are warriors in a fight, except our fight is not against flesh and blood. We don't fight physically. Ours is a spiritual battle against sin and against Satan and the forces of darkness and evil, isn't it? In the flesh and in the world around us. And the fact that he uses that word then is a powerful example of showing us how much discipline and grit and resilience and perseverance is required to live the Christian life in this battle, isn't it? It's a war. It is a war. And we're to take up our armor then. And you say, well, wait a second. Am I to then take up my sword and go on the offensive? And so when somebody strikes me with swords and daggers and word, I'm to strike them back and deal them a death blow? I'm to cut them down when they come and attack me as a Christian, as a warrior for Christ? I'm to take up my assault rifle and rapid fire, riddle them with bullets of deadly, dangerous words that are meant to kill and to destroy them? That's what I'm to do? Because who are they to talk to me like this as a Christian? I'm a child of God. How dare you? No, that's not at all what Peter's saying. That's not what he means by this arming yourselves with the same way of thinking. What does he mean? What was Jesus' way of thinking and approaching his suffering and his death? Well, he described that in chapter 2, verses 21 to 25. What did he say? When he was reviled, Jesus did not revile back. He said there was no deceit in his mouth, which means he did not sin in word and he did not sin in deed. When they insulted him, he didn't insult back. When they mocked him, he didn't mock back. When they punched him and kicked him, he didn't punch and kick them back. When they spat in his face, he didn't spit back in their faces. And when they beat him and scourged him, nor did he use the almighty divine power as God to completely annihilate them, though he could have. No, he didn't do that. What did he say in chapter 2, 21, verse 25? He entrusted himself to God and God's ultimate purpose and plan for his suffering, knowing that was the only way to save sinners. He had to go to the cross. He had to make atonement for sin. That's what it means to arm yourself with the same way of thinking. To approach suffering as Christ suffered. And what does he mean by whoever suffers in the flesh has ceased from sin? Is he saying that if we suffer in the flesh, we in some strange way are going to attain perfection, sinlessness, ceasing from sin? No, that's not what he means. What he means is, in the same way that Christ suffered and won the victory over sin decisively and permanently on the cross, when we suffer for righteousness' sake, that too proves that we have taken hold of Christ's victory by faith and it is ours, and we cease from sin. It doesn't mean we'll never commit sin, no. It means that we have taken hold of Christ's triumphant victory over the power of sin to dominate and to reign and to rule in our lives. There's a big difference. Jesus is the only sinless one. We can never obtain sinless perfection. Only Jesus, as the God-man, was sinless. And then he continues in verse 2. Our ceasing from sin is evidence that we are in Christ and Christ is in us, that his victory is ours. And as a result of ceasing to sin, we also have newness of life. We don't have to go back to our old way of sin. And that's point number 2, remembering Jesus' newness of life. when God raised him from the dead, is ours. Look at verse 2. So as to live for the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for human passions, but for the will of God. His victory is ours. His triumph is ours. We no longer live for that. We once were living for that at one level or another, for the passions of the flesh. That's what he means by human passions. He's talking about the fallen, corrupted, sinful human nature that is inclined towards sin, and it expresses itself in various desires, various passions, various lusts. We don't live for those anymore. No, we live for the will of God. And he almost says it sarcastically in the next verse, but that's what we live for. We live for the will of God. The will of God for Christ was to go to the cross. That was his mission, and he suffered for it. And our mission is also in a similar but in a lesser way to suffer for Christ's sake, because when we live differently than the world doesn't like that. The world opposes us. The world scorns us. It looks at us with ridicule and oftentimes even persecutes us. That's our mission. Christ's mission was to redeem and to save. Ours is to proclaim him and his message. And since the world was hostile to him and rejected him, it also will be hostile to us and reject us. But it's the will of God for us to live that way, to live the different lives. And we do. And he goes on to describe just what some of these old sinful passions looked like in verse 3. For the time that is past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do, living in sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, and lawless idolatry. This vice list is nothing new. There's similar ones throughout the New Testament. Paul lists similar ones in Romans 13:13 and in Galatians 5:19-20. Vice lists are common. And if you notice, by the words that he's used here, 3 of them seem to have sexual or sensual, immoral overtones, right? Sensuality, passions, and orgies. And 2 of them have overtones of intoxication with alcohol, or by extension, any illicit substance or drug, right? Drunkenness and drinking parties. And the last one there, lawless idolatry, that's almost more than just a vice. Nobody here today in our society is bowing down, well, some do in parts of the world, but not here as much, to a wooden or metal statue and idol. But this is not just a vice back then. It's almost like the occasion that it provides for the other vices to happen. In lawless idolatry, they were interconnected. See, in that society, idolatry was rampant. It was part of the social and cultural fabric of Greco-Roman life that these Christians in Asia Minor were surrounded with. Idol worship was everywhere. In private, in public, in the temples. A lot of their religions actually involved a lot of sexual morality and drunkenness together. These were intertwined. And in a similar way, today, sensuality, orgies, drinking parties, all these things happen together even today in our society, don't they? They tend to go hand in hand, these kinds of vices, when people are making plans to go out to the bar or to the club. You drink ahead of time, probably with your friends. You go, and you go for a reason, usually to hook up, to pick up with someone. These things go hand in hand, minus the lawless idolatry place. But that was common then. In fact, it was a normal part of living in that pagan society. They would worship idols. They would venerate them in public festivals and ceremonies. There was even a cult of the emperor, where they would deify the emperor as though the man was actually a god, and they would add him to the list of the gods that they would worship, the emperor. And it was particularly common and prominent in Asia Minor here. And so suddenly, if these Christians who were formerly doing all those things and worshiping idols and celebrating together in all sorts of revelry and debauchery, drinking, which usually leads to sexual morality, and idol worship as an act of consecration to their gods, suddenly they're not doing this anymore. And the watching world notices. And they take exception with this. And that's exactly what he goes on to tell us in verse 4, but even if they do take exception and they malign you and ridicule you, don't lose hope. He says, remember, Jesus is coming back to judge those who persecute you, and he will vindicate you and your faith and your way of life. Look at verse 4. With respect to this, they are surprised when you do not join them in the same flood of debauchery and they malign you. They're shocked. They're surprised. They can't believe it. They don't understand because you always used to do these things. Like these Christians always used to do those things. It was part of the norm. They did these things without thinking. Worshiping idols and consecrating yourself to them by engaging and engorging and drinking and immorality, that was normal. That was acceptable with a clean conscience. They wouldn't think twice about it. So suddenly, they're not doing it anymore. And they don't understand. They can't relate to that. And as a result of that, they begin to malign them. They begin to denigrate them. They begin to think lowly of them. In their case, they started to think of them as godless people, right? Almost like atheists today, because they're no longer worshiping the gods. You're worshiping this one God, we're worshiping 20. We're more religious than you. They looked at them as social outcasts. They ostracized them. They wouldn't bow down to the emperor. You're ostracized in society. What's wrong with you? You're participating in your love feast together. That was the Lord's table. They had thought these were weird, strange orgies for their own God, which was unacceptable to them in a hypocritical way because for them it was okay as consecration of their own God. And at this feast, you're eating the body of Christ and drinking the blood of Christ. They thought they were a strange cannibalistic folk. And they were despised. They rejected them. They maligned them. They scorned them. And in a sense, this has been the universal testimony of Christians throughout history, hasn't it? Because when you come to faith in Jesus, regardless of the type of life you had beforehand, people are going to notice if you've genuinely come to faith. Because suddenly you are a completely different person. Your values are different. Your morals are different. Your purpose is different. Your direction in life is different. Your level of compassion is different. Everything you now believe and hold to is the antithesis of worldly values. It's countercultural, it's otherworldly. You don't revile when somebody reviles you. You don't insult when somebody insults you. You turn the other cheek when somebody slaps you. When somebody takes your shirt, you give them your cloak also. You don't fight fire with fire. It's different, and they notice, and they don't like it. Because at one level or another, though they won't admit it, it pricks their conscience. But this is the uniform testimony of Christians. From today all the way back to the first century Christians to which Peter is writing. There's nothing new. Sure, some of us maybe don't have as remarkable, amazing conversion, transformation testimonies like the Apostle Paul on the Damascus Road in Acts 9, to go from someone who is persecuting and killing Christians to someone who then gives his life to proclaiming Christ, to making disciples that follow Christ, and to planting churches that worship and advance the gospel of Christ. That is remarkable. Not all of us have that. But nevertheless, he takes us and makes us anew. Some of us who've come from backgrounds similar to these Gentile Christians in Asia Minor of debauchery and immorality and perversion and corruption, we can relate. We can appreciate what Peter's saying here and the difference. We can understand why he's been using this language in his letter already. From the outset, in the very first verse of chapter 1, he says, I'm writing to exiles. And then in chapter 2, verse 19, he says, you are sojourners and aliens. And it's true. We are strangers. We're foreigners in this life. We don't belong. this is not our final destination. We are citizens of earth and on this country in particular, but more than that, we're citizens in heaven. And we feel the difference. We see the difference. We experience the derision and the ridicule and the mocking. We get why he's been talking that way, especially those Christians who've been rescued from this kind of debauchery and filth. So they don't get it. Some of us can relate to that. When your friends call you up and it's Friday night and he says, "Oh man, we heard about this amazing new club in downtown. It's popping. I heard there's going to be a lot of beautiful ladies there tonight. Come to my place, we'll pre-drink, and then we'll go take an Uber." Sorry, I can't. What do you mean you can't? I know this is going to sound strange, but a friend of mine invited me to church, and I went to church, and I heard the message and the gospel preached, and I just began to realize that suddenly all of that, the drinking, the sex, the fun, the activities, the immorality, none of that really was satisfying me. I was looking for that void, but that void and that emptiness can only be filled with the right relationship with God, which can only happen by faith in his Son and living the kind of life that he expects me to by giving up all these things which are sins and stand against him. And I don't want that anymore. That's true fulfillment. Jesus is more than enough for me. And he says, "What? What are you talking about, man? That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life. What's wrong with you?" And everyone begins to laugh, and they have their laugh and their joke. But then you keep telling them that next week, and then the next weekend again, and the next weekend again, and they start to realize something's wrong with this guy. To heck with him. We don't want him as part of our crew anymore. Or in a lesser way, maybe that wasn't you and your life before Christ. But at work, you no longer speak to your colleagues the way you used to permit yourself to speak. You no longer partake in the same kinds of immoral, perverse, crude, profane, and dirty jokes as you used to before with them. And they take notice. They take notice. "Hey, do you want to come in and join in?" I'm sorry, I can't. What? You're no fun. You're a party pooper. You're lame. What's wrong with you? What's wrong with James? "Oh, I don't know. I just asked him. He doesn't want to have lunch with us anymore. He doesn't want to take breaks with us anymore. He's weird. He says he's a Christian now and he's following this Jesus guy." Pfft. Or maybe it was something else. Something that we often take for granted as one of the lesser sins and vices. Gossiping. Gossiping. And I remind you that gossiping is not just spreading or talking about lies, something that's untrue about someone, but gossiping is also passing on juicy truths about someone to someone else behind their back. That's gossiping. And suddenly you're a Christian now. You're born again. And you start to read and to study the Word of God to find out how he expects you to live, what's pleasing to him, and you immerse yourself in church life with other Christians who are more advanced and more mature than you, and they teach you, and they show you, and you learn and grow, and you realize, wow, this is a serious sin. It can really destroy someone's reputation. It can divide and split a church in half. I don't want anything to do with this. And then your friend comes to you and says, oh my God, did you hear?" And you walk away. And she says, what's wrong with her? Or what's wrong with him? Yes, guys aren't immune to the sin of gossiping either. We can just as easily fall into that trap. But they take exception with it, and they notice. They don't like that. And what else can happen? They can start to make false accusations towards us. They think you're different, and they think that you think you're better than them. Say, "Oh, what's wrong with him? Now he doesn't go where we go anymore. He doesn't want to drink with us anymore. He doesn't want to hook up with girls anymore. He doesn't want to hang out with us. He doesn't talk like us. He doesn't walk with us. He thinks he's better than us now with his lofty morals and his new faith and his Jesus figure. Oh, she's too good to hang out with us anymore. She's too pure. She's too holy. We're beneath her. She's above us. Who does she think she is?" And they'll do that. But of course, that's not at all the truth. That's not at all what you and I think. We don't think we're better than everyone else. In fact, it's the very opposite, ironically. We've realized that we are filthier than everyone else. And that because of our sin and our total depravity, being born into sin, we are desperately cut off from God, and we need hope. We need salvation. We need rescue. And God's provided that rescue by giving his Son to be the substitute in our place for sin and to rise to newness of life. And we believe in him, and we trust in him as our Savior, and we take his righteousness, not our own. We know we have none. But they don't see that. They don't get that. But that's the truth. And that's why they do that. But even if they do that, Peter says, remember, in verse 5, they will not get away with it forever. You will not have to endure scorn and ridicule and shame and ostracization for the rest of your life, or eternity, I should say. You may have to endure it here, but it will not endure forever. No. He says, remember, Jesus is coming back to judge those who persecute you, and he will vindicate you. That's what he says in verse 5. But they will give account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. They will give an account. This is legal courtroom language that has to do with somebody giving an accounting to a judge and a jury and an executioner. That's what he's talking about. They will give account. Notice, to the living and the dead. Nobody's going to escape God's judgment, whether you're living or whether you're dead. Judgments are coming. That's the uniform testimony of the New Testament. Sooner or later, we will all be standing before the judge, he's saying. And these ones in particular, these ones who malign you and malign your faith, and in so doing blaspheme the Lord, who is the author and perfecter of your faith, they will have their judgment. If not in this life, whether things go their way, they may advance socially, they may advance financially, they may climb their way up the social class structure, they may be popular, they may be wealthy, they may be successful by human standards, but in the end, judgments are coming. Judgments are coming. And it's not a popular message, is it? To talk about judgment. Even in churches today, in Christianity. It's not. It's not popular to talk about judgment and sin and hell. That is not a good church growth strategy if you want to attract and to draw the masses. You don't talk about that. You talk about the love of God. Right? God is love, which he certainly is, 1 John 4:8. That's a de facto slogan of pop culture Christianity. God is love. God loves everyone. And come as you are. It's okay. Just come. All you have to do is believe. Just accept Jesus into your heart. Say this prayer after me, and you'll be saved. No matter what you do for the rest of your life, as though a prayer is like a magical recipe that can somehow save you. Repeating a series of words. Almost like pagan mystery religions, like they would do back then. No. That's not how it works. God is absolutely love. But he's also a lot of other things. And God has not set his love on everyone equally. Right? He doesn't love the world and those who reject him and reject the free offer of salvation in his Son the same way that he loves those who've accepted it, who've given their lives to follow him, who believe in him. That's obvious to say, isn't it? Because the church is being saved. And this other group is not being saved. They're currently under the judgment and wrath of God. So he doesn't love everyone equally. He loves his elect believers in an incredibly profound, higher, loftier, infinite way. And he is love. But God is much more than that. In theological terms, we call them his attributes that the Bible describes. His grace, his mercy, his love, his righteousness, his holiness, his justice, his infinity, his immutability, which means he doesn't change, and it goes on and on and on. But if you had to reduce all of these attributes or perfections to two categories that God is, it is he is love and he is holy. And in fact, That is the adjective, the attribute that's most used to describe God. God is holy. You see this throughout the Old Testament especially. He's a holy God. Why? To emphasize the fact that he is set apart. He's so holy, he's so set apart from sin, he can have nothing to do with sin, he's so separated from it, and that he is so holy that he must punish sin. Sin must be punished. And that's what you see in the Old Testament sacrificial system. You see the fact that sin, blood had to always be spilled for the remission of sin in the goats and the bulls and the rams and on the Day of Atonement. But that was just a shadow of that once-for-all sacrifice that could truly atone for the sins of all humanity. And that was in his Son, because his Son wasn't just a man. He didn't just have a human nature, but he was God. And because he was sinless, God accepted his sacrifice. But the whole point is, God was so holy that to deal with sin, God is so holy that to deal with sin, he gave up his only Son. That's how seriously God takes sin. That he willingly gave up his only begotten Son to take the full fury and wrath and judgment of God against sin. That's how seriously God takes sin. Because he's holy. Because he's holy. And whoever comes to God in faith and understands that and believes that they're a sinner, totally cut off from the holy God who is perfect, and that he's dealt with that sin in his own Son in your place, and you believe in that by faith, you'll be saved, he says. You'll be rescued from judgment. You will escape it. That's the only way to escape judgment. And God's provided a way to. All you have to do is believe. And the reason he did it is because he knew none of us could attain that on our own. None of us could attain sinless perfection. Even the best of men are men at best, as the saying goes. Impossible. And so when we give someone the gospel, you can't just give them half of the gospel. Go to the good part. No, you've got to give them the bad news before you get to the good news, which is what gospel means, the good news of the free grace and salvation in Christ. But you got to give them the bad news. How in the world would somebody even believe the good news and take this free gift of grace if they don't first understand that they need it? You can't skip over that part. And it seems like in a lot of churches and parts of Christianity today they have. But not us. We don't do that here. This is what the Bible teaches. He'll judge the living and he'll judge the dead. And look what he continues to say now in verse 6 about the power of this gospel. There's real power in the gospel to transform lives, to save sinners, to bring someone from a condition where they hated God, where they were their own God, where they wanted nothing to do with God, where they maligned the people of God even and persecuted them in some cases, and now is transferred into the kingdom of light and believes in God, follows God, and the God-man, Jesus as their Savior. That's the power of the gospel, and it does that for both the living and the dead, and that's what he continues to say as his final encouragement in verse 6. He says, remember the gospel about Jesus, which saves you, keeps you, and gives you an imperishable, unfading, real, and eternal hope. Look at verse 6. For this is why the gospel was preached, even to those who are dead, that though judged in the flesh, the way people are, they might live in the spirit the way God does. You say, well, wait a second now. Now this is reminiscent of last week when we were in chapter 3, verse 19. Judging the dead, preaching the gospel to the dead. What exactly is he saying here? Well, it's going to be clear in a minute. Who are these dead? Is it the same dead in chapter 3, verse 19 that we saw were the spirits who were in prison, the ones so described in Genesis 6, 1-4, the fallen angels because of the egregious sin they committed against God? Is that who he's talking about? Is this proclamation, this preaching, the same as what Christ did to them there, which was a proclamation of victory and of triumph over the forces and power of evil and sin? No, this is different now. And what gives that away is context. Remember, we talked about context being key. You got to look in the immediate context to know the meaning of certain words and what they mean. And in this case, it's clear he's not talking about fallen angels or spirits. He's talking about human beings, right? He's just talked about death and how God's coming back to judge the living and the dead and how we are now dead to sin. He's talking about human beings in this context. And so, okay, he's talking about human beings, but what is this preaching here? He went to go preach to those who are dead in hell or Hades? What is he saying? Is he saying that there's a second chance for salvation? That's not at all what he's saying. And that would fly in the face of New Testament teaching, not the least of which is in Hebrews 9:27. It is appointed for every man to die, then comes judgment. There's no second chance. And if you look at the more immediate context of Peter's situation and the Christians in it, that wouldn't make sense. Because he's encouraging them to endure suffering for doing good, if it's God's will, persecution. But if they can escape suffering and persecution here by living however they want, like the Gentiles, and still have a chance after death, what kind of motivation is it to endure persecution and suffering? It's not. Right? So the context tells you that's not at all what he's saying. He's not saying there's a second chance at salvation. Otherwise, these Christians would just say, forget it. I'm not going to live this life of following Jesus and be ridiculed and scorned and mocked and not have the same opportunities in life. Why would I do that? Just let me live like them, and I'll repent after when Jesus comes to preach the gospel to me in hell. That's not what he's saying. And even that word for preached here is different. If you look at the context. In chapter 3:19, it says there's a proclamation. And that word there, kerusso, is used in the New Testament to describe the proclamation or the heralding of the gospel, but it's also used in a general sense, just as a proclamation, as a herald of anything. And in that case, we saw it was his proclamation of victory over the forces of darkness and of sin. Here, in 4 verse 6, you see the word is preached, and that's euangelizo, and that is always, almost uniformly in the New Testament, used to describe the preaching of the gospel. The preaching of the good news. And so we know that's what he's saying now. Okay, I get it. So he's not preaching to those who are dead in hell. Then what does this confusing sentence mean? What he's saying is that even those, the gospel was preached and is being preached to those who are alive. Just as it has been preached to those who are now dead when they were yet alive. And they believed it when they were alive. Not that they're being preached after they're dead. He's saying when they're alive. The gospel is being preached by me and by you now, just as it was preached to those who are dead now. But when they were alive, they heard it, received it, and believed it. Though judged in the flesh the way people are, they might live in the spirit the way God does. That's the key here. So this is why the pagans and the unbelievers thought that Christians believed in vain. They said, if you die too, what's the point? You're not achieving some sort of otherworldly existence. You're dead just like the rest of us. What is the point of coming to faith in Christ? Well, notice what Peter says. He says that though judged in the flesh the way people are, what does he mean by that? He's not talking about the fallen, corrupted human nature. He's talking about being a human being, a physical creature. He's saying we all die. That's nothing new, believer or unbeliever. Everybody dies. This is a reality of living in a world that was corrupted by sin in the beginning because sin entered the world through Adam and death through sin physically, which means everyone dies physically without exception. And the Gentiles wanted to use that against them. They said, no, that's fine. Yeah, everybody dies. It's not unique to us or to you. That's just normal now. Death entered the world through sin. We all physically die, and physical death is part of the consequence and a direct result of sin and the precursor to God's final judgment of sin. We all must die. That's fine. We'll give you that. There's nothing wrong with that. The difference is, for us as Christians and as believers, and for Peter's audience here, death is not the end. Death is just the beginning. Because though we die physically, we have the hope of resurrection, glory, and eternal life and hope. That's the point of what he's trying to say. It doesn't end at death, it just begins. It just begins. We die in the flesh physically, right? The way people are judged. That's part of God's judgment against sin, a precursor to final judgment. But we do that in order that the rest of verse 6, we might live in the Spirit the way God does. You see, he's talking about resurrection, hope, and glory. Death is not the end. Death is by no means the end. We have that hope. They don't have that hope. They don't understand that hope. They reject that hope. They ridicule that hope. But we can't lose hope for ourselves in God's promise, and that God can use our lives even when we endure suffering and hostility and persecution, and we do so faithfully, to win them to believing this same hope. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a German theologian and pastor, Lutheran pastor. And he spent 18 months in prison for his involvement in the confessing church's resistance to Hitler and Nazi Germany. He wrote many letters and papers during his imprisonment before he was executed for his faith and for his opposition to Nazis, which were all published after his death. Here's an excerpt of one of his letters which he wrote to his twin sister. It is good to learn early enough that suffering and God are not a contradiction, but rather a unity. For the idea that God himself is suffering is one that has always been one of the most convincing teachings of Christianity. I think God is nearer to suffering than to happiness. And to find God in this way gives peace and rest and a strong and courageous heart. I think Bonhoeffer was right. God is a God who suffers, who as the God-man suffered more than you and I can fully understand or appreciate on our behalf for us. And that remembering that and holding fast to that is both a great source of strength and comfort to endure our own lesser suffering in life. Remember Jesus' victory through suffering is yours. Remember Jesus' newness of life when God raised him from the dead is yours. Remember Jesus is coming back to judge those who persecute you and will vindicate you. And remember the gospel about Jesus, which saves you, keeps you, and gives you an imperishable, unfading, real, and eternal hope. Would you bow your heads with me?